Good afternoon and most welcome to 1510. We will today talk about an article by Stephen Rosen. How can we signify being? Semiotics and topological self-signification. And I will start with the mid-paragraph on 268, and this is when Rosen is getting into Merleau-Ponty and Paul Cézanne. And I think we've gone into Cézanne earlier, it rings a bell anyway. Merleau-Ponty goes on to observe that primal dimensionality must be understood as self-containing. This is illustrated through a discussion of contemporary art, and in particular the work of Paul Cézanne. Cézanne knows already what Cubism will repeat, that the external form, the envelope, is secondary and derived, and that it is not that which causes a thing to take form. That this shell of space must be shattered, this fruit ball broken. In breaking the shell, one disrupts the classical representation of objects in space. Merleau-Ponty asks, what is there to paint then? Cubes, spheres and cones. Pure forms which have the solidity of what could be defined by an internal law of construction. Cézanne made an experiment of this kind in his middle period. He opted for the solid, for space, and came to find that inside this space, a box or container too large for them, the things began to move, color against color. They began to modulate in instability. Thus, we must seek space and its content as together. The work of Cézanne is Merleau-Ponty's primary example of the exploration of depth as originary dimension. The foregoing passage describes Cézanne's discovery that primal dimensionality is not space taken in abstraction from its content, but is the unbroken flow from container to content. It is in this sense of the internal mediation of container and content that Cézanne's depth dimension is self-containing. So there is no three-dimensional orthogonal perpendicular directions where things are. The depth is a feature of space itself. And it is primordial. Only randomly and haphazardous is or are the three-dimensionality of the Cartesian space derived. And you cannot go from the three-dimensionality of Cartesius to the originary physical space. Merleau-Ponty also makes it clear that the primal dimension engages embodied subjectivity. The dimension of depth goes toward things from as a starting point. This body, which I myself am fastened. In commenting there that there are forms and definite planes only if it is stipulated how far from me that different parts are. Merleau-Ponty is conveying the same idea. A little later he goes further. The painter's vision is not a view upon the outside, a merely physical optical relation with the world. The world no longer stands before him through representation. Rather, it is the painter to whom the things of the world give birth by a sort of concentration or coming to itself of the visible. Ultimately, the painting relates to nothing at all among experienced things, unless it is first of all auto-figurative. The spectacle is first of all a spectacle of itself, before it is a spectacle of something outside of it. End of quote. This is very close to Taine of the Mirror, where Rodolphe Gachet shows that Derrida wants to look into the mirror function of the text, and by mirroring the reader, understanding comes to the forth, and that the text is nothing in itself until it's been received. In this passage, the painting of which Merleau-Ponty speaks, in drawing upon the originary dimension of depth, draws in upon itself. Painting of this kind is not merely a signification of objects, but a concrete self-signification that surpasses the division of object and subject. I will make a depiction here. A little pause.
Okay.
First, we'll take a look at this as an oversimplification of what is meant by first dimension. It is sort of say the whole world, including the subject, which contains objects only derivatively afterwards. This space is space and objects. And it's the first dimension containing all classical dimensions, but not derivable from the classical dimensions. So to speak, the classical dimensions do not contain enough information. And here we see the Klein bottle according to Rosen and Ryan. Subject going in, opening up a hole, making space possible, which is the containing, and the contained being the objects, and the uncontained being the perceiver, if you like. This movement is very similar to the touching principle. The two chirally different hands, right and left, as different as anything can be, is the sine qua non for touching and touched. Herein we have subject, we have object, and the movement is the containing, the act, which is in gerund. Space is here at the spiral act of making space. So let me sum up here. The phenomenological dimension of depth, as described by Merleau-Ponty, is 1. The first dimension, in that it is the source of the Cartesian dimensions, which are idealization of it. It is 2. A self-containing dimension, not merely a container for contents that are taken as separate from it, and it is 3. A dimension that blends subject and object concretely, rather than serving as a static staging platform for objectifications carried out by a detached subject. In realizing depth, we surpass the concept of space as but an inert container and come to understand it as an aspect of an indivisible cycle. Cycle is important. Of action in which the contained and uncontained, object and subject, are integrally incorporated. And when the depth dimension is elucidated topologically, it proves to be a Kleinian dimension. According to Ryan, the 3 basic features of the Klein bottle are part contained, part uncontained, and part containing. We see here how the part contained opens up to form the perimeter of the container and how this in turn passes over into the uncontained aspect. The free parts of this structure thus flow into one another in a single self-containing movement, and movement is very close to the vortices we spoke about earlier, containing a chirality, which is evident here. Symbolized here in 2 dimensions is the process by which the 3-dimensional object of the life world, in the act of containing itself, is fluidly transformed into the subject. This blueprint for phenomenological interrelatedness gives us a graphic indication of how the mutually exclusive categories of classical thinking are surpassed by a threefold relation of mutual inclusion. It is this relation that is expressed in the primal dimension of depth. Kleinian depth and ontological self-signification. To be sure, our work with the Klein bottle is no exercise in pure mathematics, in which a mathematical object is signified by a definition or an algebraic formula. For us, the Klein bottle is not merely a signified object. It is a signifier, one that paradoxically signifies itself, or in the language of Peirce, the Klein bottle is a sign of itself. It is the dimensionality of this enigmatic sign that must now be given full iconic expression for an effective signification of being. It's just an excellent conception of how being comes to the fore, how presencing is happening, and how movement is the reason for stillness, and how stillness creates movement. In associating the dimension of depth with both natal space and matrix of every other existing space. In characterizing it as a polymorphous being, it can morph into many things. Merleau-Ponty makes it clear that true depth is an ontological dimension. And the Klein bottle as the topological embodiment of depth is an ontological signifier. It depicts being. In a true sense, of course, this merely alphabetic description of the Klein bottle will not suffice. The one-dimensional, arbitrarily agreed on typographic marks that makes up the sign vehicles of the text you are reading can hardly do justice to the higher and deeper dimensionality of Kleinian being per se. We have seen that the conventional written text can do no more than objectify being. And render it an abstraction. What is required to avoid objectification is a sign vehicle capable of encompassing in depth the three-dimensional reality of the signifying subject and thus signifying being by signifying not some objectified other, but itself. My comment here, this is exactly what Paul Cézanne was pointing to. The self-reflective or Gachet-Derridian, the mirroring that makes being true. The figure we have seen surpass alphabetic expression, giving iconic renditions of the Klein bottle. But these two-dimensional images still lack the necessary dimensionality. They fail to achieve Kleinian self-signification because the Kleinian container engages three objective dimensions and realizes concrete self-reference via the fourth dimension, the dimension encompassing our lived subjectivity. In this ontological text then, a three-dimensional Kleinian signifier must be provided that opens the way to phenomenological blending of subject and object. One method for achieving an in-text 3D effect is the production of an anaglyph, a composite photograph made up of two superimposed images shot in contrasting colors. This approach could be taken with a Klein bottle, but the picture would have to be viewed with a special glasses whose lenses are of corresponding colors. Beyond the fact that the anaglyph would necessitate special viewing equipment, there is a deeper issue. Granting that such a Kleinian signifier would suggest three-dimensionality, how effectively would it open itself to the fourth dimension? The anaglyphic Klein signifier comes ready-made, in the sense that no conscious perceptual adjustment is demanded of the viewer for an effective reading of the image. This way of presenting the Klein bottle is conducive to continuing to view it as something out there, detached from the viewer's subjectivity. Bearing in mind the need to enlist the fourth dimension for the full-fledged realization of the ontological Kleinian text. Let me describe a different way of producing a 3D Kleinian signifier, one that may better be suited to Kleinian self-signification. Three-dimensional perception can be simulated by a stereoscopic technique that does not require special glasses or any other optical equipment. For a simple example of this, let's return to the Necker cube. We can in fact construct the cube stereoscopically. Briefly, you can see it here. And if you watch carefully, you can notice the absolute shifting from one to another. This is very close to the shifting of inner to the outer, and also the shifting of law to practice, and to necessity to liberation. All those features are sharing the same stereoscopic feature. They can be seen two ways, and actually they are two ways. That is the point with the Kleinian iconic depiction, that things are two ways. Without an inner, the Necker cube would not be a cube. Without an outer, the Necker cube wouldn't be an Necker cube. The two-sidedness of inner and outer are the two sides of a cube, the back side and the front side. They come simultaneously, but we can only see for our inner eyes one at a time. And I think that illusion or misconception is very close to the misuse of Wittgenstein, confusing what I say about my perception with my perception. There is no similarity there, but there is a Necker cube-like aspectiveness, because one excludes the other. When I talk about my perception, no longer is any perception possible, and vice versa. You can parse the two ones into one by focusing on the X in the middle. I will not do that because I fear it will give me a migraine. But do try it at home. There will be a link to the text, and they will become stereoscopic and making up one singular cube. The Klein bottle clearly shows, without an externality, as in the text earlier by Hans Rie, by the Ecclesia, there cannot be an inner world. You cannot have an inner belief, faith, or understanding without physically participating outwards. They are the same, just as any other object in the universe. They are all built the Kleinian way, stereoscopically. What you will do if you mistake the inner for something separate is the inner will diminish. But if you, on the other hand, take in the Klein bottle, a possibility of proprioception will come about. It signifies an organism's sensitivity to activity in its own muscle, joints and tendons, my corporal structure. But it also draws back upon oneself, and this is this rare today, so seldom that McGilchrist called it only a few geniuses, the capacity for abstract intellectual self-reflection. And for that to be possible, the subject oneself must be acknowledged as constituting the world, because space is built out of the subject. Detachment makes the world disappear and oneself. And you will realize in the shifting of the Necker cube that you are participating, because you shift it, but it also shifts objectively. The Necker cube is one of the greatest discoveries during the 18th century. Do realize that it is actually literally two different chemical constituents. It's not an illusion. The world is built that way. And in quantum physics we know whether a quark, the smallest entities, they are not material, but their chirality, which is also stereoscopically, is wholly dependent on the subject, and that is the building material of time and space. The Cartesian gap is the stopping of thinking and sensing. When proprioception is no longer there, what we sense instead is the blindness, or a blanket term or a blanket experience for nothingness. There is no substance to the Cartesian space. We cannot understand it, or we can get into it and make it as a Kleinian bottle. It's not an illusion in that case, it is similar to a hallucination. But you can never ever perceive the Cartesian space. It's an absolute impossibility. It is what you say to yourself, your experience, when there is no experience, or there is no active movement. I'm amazed how subtle the differences are, but also the great likeness between Merleau-Ponty, Wittgenstein and the Derridian take of the absolute. And it's easy to see that logocentrism, or the metaphysics of now, is when the movement, the containing, has stopped and we get fixated. And it's obvious when you read Derrida that there is no understanding anymore. It has turned the text into neo academia. It doesn't give, there is no new understanding, but it is unsurmountable repetition, a friction of the mind, or as Heidegger had it, it is denken, unthankful thinking. Maybe there's a question from my dear colleague here. Come into the picture.
Can you put it here? Oj,
Oh,
oj,
sorry.
oj, oj,
Ja,
oj,
ja,
vänta.
ingenting oj över. Nothing is destroyed.
So let me return to the page 269. And where did the pen disappear? Here. Okay. So let me see if I understood it correctly. So I think Rosen is ambiguous, perhaps intentionally. So containing is, so to say, the space. Of course, it's perhaps everything in one sense.
Can you Hans check if people see?
That's good. Okay, thank you. So and the uncontained, you could say this is the uncontained, and you could compare it with our throat, perhaps to it anthropomorphic, and the throat is uncontained. in the sense that the food passes only quickly through the throat, and the contained is this, the object is the stomach, so to say, here. So it's a good illustration. So we could say, to make it very precise, we could say that the stomach is the contained. Contained is the stomach, belly, and it's also here called the object by Rosen. And he calls, let me to be so as precise as possible, so uncontained, we could say it's throat, and it's also called the subject. And everything floats together, so to say. So this is, so to say, and he is good to have this participle containing something active, so the space, so to, we could say the space contains things in one sense, or you could more correctly perhaps say relations do the action or the movement. Movement is perhaps the moving, perhaps, to make it move. So it's everything here. Nothing is static. If it's static, it dies. So it, we could say the food and then enters here through the throat in the stomach, the object. And so now something else related to this is this book by T.H. Lawrence. He's famous. He lived in the 1920s and 30s. He wrote the best-selling book Lady Chatterley's Lover. And he wrote also a book about the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation in the Bible. And this is the last thing that Lawrence wrote about the book of Revelation. And here on page 62, Lawrence criticizes the book of Revelation. He says, if it's imagery, it is imagery which cannot be imagined. For how can four beasts, that is in book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 4 verse 6, how can four beasts be full of eyes before and behind? That is, you see, eyes here and behind. And how can they, these four beasts, be in the midst of the throne and round about the throne? Lawrence comments, they can be somewhere and somewhere else at the same time, affirms Lawrence. But I was thinking with this clown model. The eyes can be in the midst of the throne and round about the throne. So there is really no contradiction if we think about these eyes as part of the uncontained and the contained. So the eyes are everywhere. The throne, in one way, this resembles a throne. In one, so you have, you could say that you have the seat here. God sits. This is the throne of God, and the God is sitting here. In one way, and then you have. So in that sense, everything flows together. It's difficult to grasp completely the image, but I think everything, there's no separation that in heavens as Lawrence imagines. He wants a separation, a Cartesian separation. Everything has to be. There should be no contradictions. The eyes are outside. They cannot be also behind. So back to Hans.
No, very good, Kalle. Thank you for that. You said relating, very good. Carlo Rovelli, the containing could also, another way of looking at it, the relating, the movement of relating. And this is the relatee, and this is the related. They have a free division. Space is also relational. This, I think that could be helpful. And this is also what Paul Cézanne, that space has inherently the features that relates what later becomes objects. It's the same in quantum mechanics. Before space and time is enveloped we have events. They are more more foundational, I think would be the right term. They're constituting everything. And to understand the relations between the objects, we need to get into the one first primordial dimension. And this is the process of doing this, which is an act. It's not a standstill. It's not me photographing the world. Click, 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 as a friend of mine called it. He wanted to have 1,000 cameras at home to have a snapshot of all of reality. I think that's verging on getting insane. Wittgenstein said himself, well, you can quote Heidegger here, because he thought the first or the earlier Wittgenstein to be eerie, as you might remember from maybe 300 episodes ago. And he was. There was the idea that language didn't come from anywhere, and so the world was not here. Later he changed into this more close to Heidegger view of the later Wittgenstein in philosophical investigations. It's a shame that Heidegger never went deeply into that. There were some connections, but not a lot. But it goes to show that once you understand how things work, the movement starts again. And that is the creative movement of being. Well, thank you very much for our adventure into Paul Cézanne, Merleau-Ponty, Wittgenstein, Stephen M. Rosen, Derrida, and of course
Lawrence,
who also wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is a recommended read, I think, if you want something exciting. Thank you very much and have a pleasant afternoon.